So far, we've looked at the origins of agriculture and of animal domestication in the Old World. Lecture 18 takes us to the Americas. And this time we're going to tell the story of the origins of food production in the New World. We're going to begin with a discussion of the major crops and animals domesticated in the Americas and describe the three major centers of plant domestication. Then I'm going to describe the archaeological evidence for the domestication of maize from its wild ancestor, a grass in Central America called teosinte. We'll look at the archaeological evidence for early maize cultivation in Mesoamerica. And I should add here that Mesoamerica is that area of Central America where the pre-Columbian civilizations arose. And we'll see that this cultivation in Mesoamerica is as early as 3600 BC, if not considerably earlier. And then we'll trace the spread of maize into the Andes region, where other crops, such as the potato, one of the great crops of the world today, were domesticated as early as 2000 BC. And then finally, we'll analyze what we know about the spread of maize and bean agriculture into North American Southwest and into the eastern woodlands of the United States. You see, in the latter area, maize and bean farming transformed the landscape and helped foster the rise of North America's powerful Mississippian chiefdoms. I should note here that we'll describe both the Pueblo societies of the Southwest and the Mississippian in Lecture 31 in Part 6 of this course. This lecture concludes Part 3 and our discussion of the origins and spread of food production. In Part 4, we'll describe the origins of the world's earliest urban civilizations. The Native Americans domesticated an extraordinary range of indigenous plants, some of which, maize, potatoes, and tobacco in particular, as well as the tomato, were rapidly adopted by farmers on other continents after European contact in 1492. In fact, at the time of Columbus, the Native Americans arguably were the most expert farmers in the world. They domesticated hundreds of forms of potato alone. But the most important of all their crops was Indian corn, properly called maize, the only significant wild grass in the New World to be domesticated and farmed on a very large scale. Root crops were another substantial food source as well, especially in tropical South America and high in the Andes. But the Native Americans cultivated many other crops as well: amaranth, beans, chilies, and sunflowers, to mention only a few. But there's one difference, apart from the different crops, between the Old World and the New, and that is in the area of domesticated animals. In sharp contrast to the Old World, the ancient Native Americans had few domesticated beasts, but these included the alpaca and the llama of the Andes, and the dog, the turkey, and the Muscovy duck. They did not have the wild prototypes, as it were, to domesticate sheep, goats, and oxen or horses, the latter two, of course, becoming important animals for riding and draft purposes in the Old World. How then did agriculture begin in the Americas? Most experts now agree that there were 2 or 3 centers of plant domestication in the Americas. Mesoamerica for maize, beans, squash, and sweet potatoes. The central Andean highlands of South America for root crops like potatoes, uluca, and oca. And the lowland tropics between Colombia, Panama, and Peru for squashes and other tropical plants. In later times, at least 4 major farming areas developed: tropical South America, the Andean region, Mesoamerica, and eastern North America. Tropical food production in the Americas may have begun in small-scale household gardens in forest villages. In Panama, for example, as early as the 9th millennium BC. That's very early. Then you're getting into the sort of area of time of Southwest Asia or China. But the problem is that in tropical environments like this, preservation conditions are so poor that it is very difficult indeed for us to actually recover the material. And such as we know about this comes mainly from plant phytoliths and other very inconspicuous evidence. But this small-scale horticulture of wild plants eventually developed into a much larger scale form of slash and burn agriculture. You'll recall we talked about this with the Ban-Keramic people of Europe, a process that did not spread very widely in the Panama region till about 5,000 to 4,000 BC, just about the time that maize was being domesticated in the higher areas of Central America. Now, the first domesticated plants may well have been squashes and bottle gourds, both of which were in use probably in the lowlands and certainly in highland Mesoamerica by about 8,000 BC. But these obviously are domesticated plants of fairly limited application in terms of diet. The classic triumvirate of American crops was maize, beans, and squash. Of these, maize was the staff of life at the time of European contact for people living between Canada and Argentina and Chile, from sea level to high in the Andes, in rainforests and in semi-arid lands. This crop was the staple. This crop was the crop that allowed large, complex states to develop in some parts of the Americas. It allowed sedentary settlement, much higher population densities, and especially when combined with beans, was the engine which drove Native American civilization. Obviously, and inevitably, intense debate surrounds the wild ancestry of maize. For years, scholars looked for the wild prototype, for a wild maize. But after years of controversy, it was finally proven that the wild ancestor of maize was not a wild form of the corn itself, but an indigenous grass which grows naturally over much of Mesoamerica, a grass called teosinte. The process of domesticating teosinte to turning it into maize may well have begun as an unintentional consequence of harvesting teosinte. This is a grass that was gathered widely by hunter-gatherer societies before farming came along. And just as happened with wild wheat, just as happened with millet up in northern China, the gathering of the wild grass may well have created selective pressure for more harvestable forms of teosinte, forms in which the spikes of the wild grass shrunk into bunches. In time, this form of grass would become established by campsites and in abandoned refuse middens. And in time, too, perhaps people began weeding teosinte. Then they began to deliberately plant the modified teosinte. And then soon, the grass's reproductive strategy became dependent not on the wild, but on human intervention. And maize was the result. Maize was domesticated. Now, this is obviously a theoretical scenario. What archaeological evidence is there for early maize agriculture? The best evidence we have at the moment, and I do stress the words at the moment because everything in world prehistory is up for grabs, a single discovery can change so much, was found many years ago by a remarkable American archaeologist named Richard McNeish. He investigated a series of open sites, rock shelters and caves in Mexico's Tehuacan Valley. The hunter-gatherer groups living in this arid valley were hunters, but mainly plant foragers. And they placed more and more emphasis on plant collecting after about 8000 BC. Why? Simply because the climate was getting drier, they had hunted out the game, and so plant foods were the only substitute. How do we know this? Because the cave deposits in Tehuacan are very dry. And McNeish was able to collect large samples, not only of wild plants, but when he got to those levels, of very early maize cobs as well. By about 4500 BC, at least 90% of the Tehuacano diet was wild grasses, cacti, and maguey. So much grass was needed that some form of cultivation of native plants must have been essential by this time. Do we have the proof? No, but it's clear that the scenario was developing in a very similar way as it developed in China and in Southwest Asia. I should stress, though, that the archaeological record of this is not nearly as complete as that, for example, from Abu Huraira, the early farming site in Syria, where they were able to use the flotation method to collect truly enormous samples of plants. But one day, hopefully, they will do this in this area. The earliest small maize cobs, not teosinte, but maize, in Tehuacan Valley, appear at about 3600 BC. By this time, people had domesticated crops which were easily stored. Maize, beans, and squash. The triumvirate was probably domesticated by this time, maybe actually even earlier than this. We don't yet know. The important point is that compared with the time when Richard McNeish dug at Tehuacan, we are now able not just to radiocarbon date the hearths of the levels in which these cobs were found, but the actual cobs themselves, which means that our dates for domesticated crops are far more accurate than they were a generation ago. Now, the earliest Tehuacano maize cobs were smaller than modern-day ones. They were less than 2 inches long. Very small, not nearly as productive as the maize of later times. But we can be sure of one thing. Maize was probably not domesticated in the Tehuacan Valley earlier than anywhere else. Current estimates place the domestication of maize in southwestern Mexico, probably near the Bolsa River, somewhere around 3600 BC, or maybe a couple of thousand years earlier. We don't know. The date is exactly not known, but certainly by 3600 BC, and we also suspect that maize reached the Tehuacan Valley some 350 short years later. The common ancestral corn was an 8-rowed form of maize. It's known as maize de ocho, and that's the corn represented in the Tehuacan Valley. It was a common ancestral corn which eventually spread thousands of miles from its original homeland after 3000 BC. Such then is the scenario for the first domestication of maize. Central America, probably southwestern Mexico, perhaps as early as 4,000 or 5,000 BC, and certainly by 3600. But what about other crops? As maize was domesticated in Mesoamerica, Other crops were tamed in the Andes. Among them, a grain called quinoa, which has never really achieved a popularity outside the Andes until recent years, when it's become a favorite vegetable for foodies in upscale restaurants in North America. And of course, a much greater and more important crop, the potato. When was the potato and when quinoa first domesticated? We don't exactly know. The earliest date we have at the moment is somewhere around 2000 BC. That's after maize. But in all probability, when the archaeological evidence is more complete, we will find that these tubers were domesticated very much earlier, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 years earlier. I have no idea, I'm just guessing. But I wouldn't bet the farm on 2000 BC. I think it's earlier than that. But we do know that by the time of the Spanish contact in the 15th century AD, the Andeans used hundreds of potato varieties. We also know, in parenthesis, that the potato traveled to Spain in the pocket of conquistador, but really didn't become popular for a long time. It was thought to be poisonous, it was thought to be an aphrodisiac. But when it did take hold in Northern Europe and Ireland in particular, it became a staple. And as you know, the Irish potato famine of the 1840s resulted from concentration on a single potato variety. In contrast, the Andeans used dozens. A very simple agricultural precaution. Maize, as opposed to potatoes, first appeared on the Peruvian coast from the north as early as 1800 BC. It was to become one of the staples of lowland Andean civilization, which we describe much later in Lecture 34. What about North America? Let's start in the southwest. In 10,000 BC, a scattered, teeny population of desert hunter-gatherer groups inhabited the North American southwest. Their lifeway, based on small game and plant foods, survived little changed for thousands of years. Putting the tape, as it were, thousands of years forward, between about 2500 BC and 100 BC, the climate of the Southwest was relatively stable and perhaps somewhat wetter than it is today. However, as had been true from the very beginning, the environment was one where hunting and gathering were high-risk occupations. Why? Because the rainfall was so unpredictable. You had drought cycles, you had wet cycles, and the population expanded and contracted. But obviously the realities of this very arid environment meant that population densities were low. It also may have meant that there were occasional food shortages. And in arid times, people tended to live as much as possible near reliable, permanent sources of water where the best food supplies were to be found. But under this circumstance, domesticated plants like maize and beans have an enormous advantage. They're predictable and easily stored. However, they're very difficult to grow in what, from an agricultural point of view, with such irregular rainfall, are marginal environments. The first Mesoamerican crops to cross the Rio Grande were maize, beans, and squash, all probably cultivated in northern Mexico for many centuries by farmers who occasionally maybe had sporadic contact with hunter-gatherers to the north. One of the things about agriculture you have to remember is that hunter-gatherers, for example, the California Indians, were well aware of agriculture. They had no incentive to take it up. The Australian Aborigines knew of farmers in the islands to the north, but again, they had no incentive to do it. They had enough to eat. But in the southwest, a combination of slowly rising population and food shortages may have created a desire to start adopting the cultivation of maize. The opportunity had been there for thousands of years, but finally, now they had this contact with farming societies, it appeared that they adopted a low-yielding form of maize called chapalote. Now this is a small popcorn of great genetic diversity, which arrived in the southwest somewhere between 2000 and 1500 BC. Here the people soon crossbred it with indigenous wild teosinte to produce a far more productive hybrid maize. Now these people were not amateurs as far as plants were concerned. They might be beginning to cultivate, but they were well aware of what could be done with it. At first, maize was a casual supplement to the traditional diet, just as it had been in the southwest, just as it had been with other crops, of course, in both cases, in northern China. But then things changed. As maize de ocho, with its larger, more productive kernels, appeared, a large kerneled corn adapted to the realities of the southwest began to be used. And this was very suitable for an environment like the southwest, where growing seasons were short and the environments varied dramatically within a few miles. But the real change came later, after 500 BC, after there'd been maize in the southwest for at least 1,000 years. This was the point at southwestern farmers living in small scattered settlements combined maize with beans. Beans, of course, have one very vital advantage. If they are underplanted with maize, they return vital nitrogen to the soil, which has been sucked out of it by the maize. So they were underplanted. And if you combine the two, it enables the farmer to maintain the fertility of the soil very much longer. The result, in the southwest, a much greater dependence on agriculture in southwestern life at a critical moment when populations locally were rising and where people were beginning to settlement in much more permanent villages, which eventually became the Pueblos of the southwest. Between AD 300 and 500, another complex of tropical plants, including pigweed and cotton, arrived in the southwest. These crops were more demanding. They required more irrigation. They required warmer conditions and were confined to the southern areas of the southwest. So you get here developing a scenario of small-scale agriculture, more intensive settlements, the beginning of irrigation, a very sophisticated adaptation to a very, very complex, harsh environment. So as life became more sedentary, people began to invest more and more time in agriculture. Why? Because it produced protection from wild food shortages. The result? Gradual cultural change during the first millennium AD, which culminated in the great Pueblo cultures of the Southwest, which we describe in Lecture 31. Let's now move to eastern North America, to the Midwest and the East, where equally well maize agriculture became firmly entrenched in the last 2,000 years. After 10,000 BC, at a time when there were major environmental changes in Europe, when there were beginnings of farming in Southwest Asia, and perhaps even in Egypt, the archaic hunter-gatherer societies of eastern North America were becoming increasingly diverse. As we said before, many of them settled in fertile river valleys, by estuaries and on lake shores. And as these populations rose slowly, local hunter-gatherer territories became more confined, and some plant foods began to be in short supply. How do people cope with this problem? They collaborate. From this collaboration in the food quest, perhaps more complex social organization develops. At the same time, they become more interdependent. There is a greater volume of exchange of foodstuffs and luxuries, much of it in the hands of more entrepreneurial people, perhaps kin leaders, whoever, who inevitably began to rise to the top of a somewhat elementary social pyramid. And of course, great improvements were made in storage technology, because as you know, farming is rather like a savings account at a bank. You either make it grow or you deplete it. And the combination of these innovations helped alleviate food shortages. But inevitably people were living in the same places for much longer periods of time. So again, here as they did in the Southwest, in Mexico and many other places, they turned to the deliberate cultivation of local plants to increase natural supplies. They turned to native grasses, goosefoot, March elder. They turned to gourds and they turned to sunflowers. And these were being cultivated in many places as early as 2500 BC. But everywhere, this cultivation was a supplement to a hunter-gatherer diet. And this lasted for centuries, because this hunter-gatherer society, based as it was in very fertile river valleys with migrating waterfowl and fish, didn't need that much extra food. So much so that for many centuries, this sideline agriculture supported, as well as hunting and gathering, major social changes, including elaborate burial rituals and huge earthworks, which we'll describe in Lecture 31. And then, inevitably, maize and bean agriculture spread across the southern plains into the Midwest and Southeast between AD 450 and 800, during early medieval times in Europe. This was a new sort of farming, more demanding. It required intensive labor on heavy river soils and resulted in the transformation not only of the landscape, but of society. This wasn't supplementary agriculture. This involved land clearance, collaboration of a lot of people, forests being felled, and the complete transformation of river floodplains. The result being that, in many cases, the wild stands of foods vanished in the face of much more organized agriculture. And with the transformation of the landscape and the economy came completely new societies, which were based on the traditional beliefs of earlier times and culminated in the appearance of elaborate chiefdoms, described in Lecture 31, the Mississippian chiefdoms, which were at their peak just before the Spanish arrived in North America. Everywhere maize took hold on a large scale, society became more elaborate, society became more sedentary, social organization became more complex, and long-distance exchange assumed great importance. Maize spread as far north as the St. Lawrence Valley and was an underpinning of Iroquois society. The only places where it really didn't take hold were the Arctic North and the West, the Desert West and the Coastal West, where complex hunter-gatherer societies survived until European contact. In this lecture, we've described the origins of food production in the Americas, and especially the story of maize. We've surveyed the main crops and animals domesticated by ancient Native Americans and described 3 areas where domestication began. Our main focus has been maize, which originated from the wild grass teosinte. We concluded it was first domesticated in southwestern Mesoamerica. We described the spread of maize into North America and into the western woodlands, and we've shown how in both these areas the new crop was the foundation for more elaborate societies. Maize was the staff of life. And now we've looked at agriculture, the staff of life. It is time in part 4 to look at the world's earliest civilizations.